to everyone, and welcome also this morning to Mr. William Bird, Director Media Monitoring Africa, who will be giving evidence this morning. Welcome to you, sir, and thank you for availing yourself this morning. Let me just introduce to you quickly the panel. I'm the Chair, Andre Gaum, Commissioner Pelilin Tuli. He's one of our co-panelists sitting on my left, and on my right, Commissioner Chris Nissen, who is also a fellow panelist. Then the evidence team. Hanshu, do you want to introduce the evidence team, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. It's Advocate Ofensa Matlasedi and Advocate Moraka to my right.
Thank you very much. So before we start, I'd just like to administer the oath, as we always do during these hearings. So, Mr. Bird, are you willing to take the oath, or do you want to affirm the truth of your evidence?
I'll take the oath, that's fine.
Do you consider the oath as binding on your conscience?
Yes, I do.
Do you swear that the evidence you will be giving will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
And sorry, sir.
And say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you so much. I see you have a presentation, so
yes.
You will start with the presentation, and then the evidence team will ask you certain questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As the Commissioner pleases. Thanks. May I begin? Saint, if we can start the slideshow, please. Sorry for members of the audience, there's a presentation that is unfortunately not something you can see. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give an overview of the presentation, which will start with a little bit about MMA and why it's relevant for these particular hearings. Then we'll look at an overview of the prevalence and impact of disinformation and content that incited violence across social media platforms during the unrest. We'll look at some of the trends of disinformation and report it to the Real 411 system. We'll look at the human rights implications of this type of content and an overview of existing mechanisms to deal with some of these things. And I guess in making the submission, a core part of our goal was to not just review what's already occurred, but to look at ways and mechanisms of how we make sure that we can prevent some of the things we've seen happening again and taking good action on them. Next slide, please. So MMA is an NGO we've been running since 1993, so that's 29 years odd. Our objective is to promote development of a free, fair, ethical, critical media culture. I'm very familiar with the members in the room, and particularly the South African Human Rights Commission. We've played a role in media monitoring and engaged with media and civil society. We do it on a regular basis. We make submissions, we provide training, we build tools, all sorts of things. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's more about that. We've got a long history with the South African Human Rights Commission. In 1999, we worked together with the Commission on the racism in media inquiry, which was a very controversial thing at the time. Maybe a few people in the room remember that period. More recently, we've made submissions on the social media charter that the South African Human Rights Commission has developed. We are an amicus, a friend to the court in the Matumba matter, which the South African Human Rights Commission has taken to the Equality Court. And we're in the process of finalizing an MOU on trying to help deal with hate speech. So we really do welcome this opportunity to be here, and thank the Commission for inviting us and for allowing us to give evidence this morning. The goal of our input really is to provide an overview so that we can understand the trends and role of social media with a view of seeing what we can do to prevent a similar crisis in the future. So our approach as MMA is to say we need to strike a balance. Sorry, next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot that I'm doing it. I'm busy on my screen. Next slide, please, Saint. That's it, thank you. So we try and strike a balance between freedom of expression with other rights and interests. And this approach is particularly relevant because of the issue that we're dealing with today around harmful speech, around mis and disinformation, and how we deal with it, and particularly around online content, because it's such a difficult thing to do, to strike that balance, and dealing with a rights-based approach is fundamentally about, in our view, striking a balance. Next slide, please. So when we look at oh, that's interesting. Some of the content hasn't appeared. When we look at combating disinformation, we've been doing quite a lot of work on this for the last, 2018 to about the last 4 or 5 years. And we've undertaken some strategic litigation looking at disinformation. There was a Trevor Manuel case where we introduced issues of trying to balance freedom of expression, dignity, equality, and address disinformation. Then there's the Matumba matter, with the SAHRC. And there's currently a case before the High Court. We're taking a case on review involving COVID and disinformation and a broadcaster. So it's a really key area for us to address. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've developed, and I'm going into detail on this a little bit because of it feeds into and served as a background for our submission, is an online public complaints platform called Real 411. And the reason it's there is because social media platforms have their own rules, they're different to each other, and they're not local. So when we looked at our media environment in the lead up to our 2019 elections, we saw that all of our other media, every other major institution has to play by the same rules in an election period. The one vast exception to that was, of course, social media. They fell outside of that, and we didn't think that that was appropriate, that we should have people outside of South Africa deciding on policies not of our own making, not of our own input, and not of our own ability to influence or have any determinant on them, deciding on matters that may impact our elections. The other thing we looked at was we said you need to be able to mitigate the harms as they occur, because it's one thing to say, oh, this is disinformation, but you need to be able to act on that, to do something about it, to try and reduce its speed, reduce its impact. And that was one of the other reasons why we looked at a system like this. We also said you need an independent approach. So you can't have government setting these kinds of structures up, precisely because if you look around the world at the various other efforts to do something vaguely similar, states that tend to do these things are states that tend to encroach in unacceptable ways on freedom of expression, usually for political purposes. And that's not something that we want to do, and certainly would run contrary to our constitution. We also said we needed an easy, efficient, and speedy mechanism. There's no point, social media moves so fast. Saying, let's take this through the courts is a good idea, but it's going to be a very, very slow and long process. We know if you look at some of the freedom of expression cases that have been before the courts, I think including the Trevor Manuel one, which was heard on a fairly expedited basis. From memory, it took at least three to 4 years to resolve, and that was just on the basis of a few comments. So when you're dealing with a crisis like the unrest in July, that's not going to help anything in that sort of time frame. And the final reason why we need a platform like this is that you need the same rules for all. It's essential that whether content or harmful speech is said on Twitter, on TikTok, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on any of these platforms, wherever it's said, the same rules must apply for all. It's a basic principle of our justice system. Next slide, please. So there's an outline of how the system works, and I'm happy to go into detail and answer any questions about it, but I will just say that it works with volunteers. A team of at least 4 people looks at something individually, each piece of content. It's just about impossible to bias the outcome of that. So and we've reviewed over 2,000 complaints in the time that we've been running. We still work with the IEC, the Independent Electoral Commission, the National Department of Health, GCIS, Department of Communications and Digital Technology on COVID, and we're part of the RCCE team, which I'll get to later. Next slide, please. So if we look now at the prevalence and impact of disinformation across the platforms, we do know that concerning and at times harmful content was being spread, which appears to have contributed to the anger and facilitated the incitement to violence and disorder. And we know this because, next slide please, this has already been highlighted in some instances before this very inquiry, but we also know that at the time, in fact in the lead up to it, we had people writing in the media, and anyone that, if there are any references to or questions about references in the presentation, they're all coming directly from our written submissions. We saw that various people were speaking to the role that social media had been playing, and there you can see one of the quotes toward, mobilizing people towards anarchy. The Institute for Security Studies, both beforehand and I believe before the inquiry, argued that images and videos of burning infrastructure, fences torn down, generate their own momentum. They've arguably provoked further violence and threats of racialized and militia-like counter-attacks. Next slide, please. We also then saw our President Ramaphosa. He said on at least 2 occasions, I've just included the one quote, "We should refrain from posting and circulating inflammatory messages on social media and from spreading rumors or false reports." So when it reaches the office of the President, we know that it's not just something that NGOs and a few social media people are concerned about. We also saw police spokesperson Brenda Muridli saying the incessant spreading of such fake and malicious posts will not be taken lightly. In this regard, at least 5 suspects have in the past week been arrested for recording or creating inflammatory messages. Police have been ordered to look into these messages and find the perpetrators behind them. So we saw direct police action, according to the spokesperson. I'm not sure what's become of those people or what's become of those cases and where they are. Next slide, please. We then saw a number of our media, and both locally and internationally, so the Mail and Guardian as an example, the BBC and Reuters, offering tools and tips to help fact check some of the content that was already occurring. So it was something that was clearly playing a key role in one of our uprisings. And in the Business Live report, you can see they talk about the ramifications are manifold. The famous quote, "A lie can travel around the world and back again while the truth is still lacing up its boots," resonates more than ever. While professional journalists are trying to verify the facts before filing their reports, a deliberate falsehood created to stoke panic or anger can spread like wildfire across social media. So this was clearly a critical thing that was critical set of issues that was occurring. Next slide, please. So what follows here are some of the trends that were reported to the Real 411 platform, and we've just grouped them into some of the themes that we saw. So we saw there were a number of posts or content coming in that were speaking to fake protests. So there was a tweet alleging that prisoners in Escort Correctional Service Center are refusing to eat. They're on a hunger strike because they want Ubaba released, referring to former President Zuma. There was posts of an old video of a taxi protest saying that they were in support of Zuma in the CBD. There was a post of an MVA members marching in formation. alleging they were gathering in Diepkloof, but again, that was not something that was relevant and occurring at the time. We reported, received a report of a tweet by the same user which showed a video of a taxi strike on a highway. And again, so there was this idea that at the time of creating this sense that there's something bigger going on, even what was already outside of what actually was going on. So we know that the unrest and the violence and the deaths were all tragically far too real, but there were all of these other things going on to help stoke and promote and encourage and incite that. So we also saw a WhatsApp message showing a fake letter of apology by the vendor nation for alleged mistreatment of former President Zuma by President Ramaphosa. So again, these things have a very clear line and link to the politics that was occurring at the time and tying directly into that and encouraging violence. Next slide, please. The second group, excuse me, the second group of posts that were reported to Real 411 spoke directly to incitement to violence. So there was the one that said, "Burn everything forces. President Zuma was sent to prison by thugs in robes who take bribes. Burn everything, we must find the addresses of judges." So that was a pretty damn insightful tweet, but what was interesting is Real 411, we used the legal definition of incitement, and that it didn't quite meet the criteria because there was no direct time and date as to when. So for incitement, you have to be very clear and very direct, and it didn't meet that criteria, but clearly suggesting that judges are thugs and that they take bribes and that they should be located could lead easily to further violence and harm. Then there was an expletive written tweet with an image of the Constitutional Court with a message, "You better hurry up, mother fuckers. The Concord, we're waiting for your effing judgment on President Zuma. This time around, if you get it wrong, we'll burn your mother effing court." That account has since been suspended, and that tweet was one of the ones that was reported that was acted on, and we can discuss the response of the platforms to that. Excuse me, sorry. And then there was a WhatsApp group called Indians Will Know Us, which had various images of firearms on display, messages of hate speech, incitement to violence against Indians. That was another series of posts and complaints. There was a tweet by an account purportedly owned by Duduzane Zuma, saying let everything burn. And then we saw doctored and likely dubbed video which claims that to depict a speech by the eThekwini mayor inciting the killing of Indian and white people and the burning of their houses. So obviously these things in a time of great anxiety, in a time of actual ongoing violence, are things that are clearly deeply and profoundly problematic. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next theme was around posts that sought to sow fear and confusion. So there were ones about prisoners being released, just willy-nilly, apparently. There were messages that claimed that the Checkers Hyper in Roodepoort had been set alight by looters. So that just, feeding into what was going on at the time and giving a sense of it's actually spreading even further. And so the way you make people fear and even more and not know what's going on, you do precisely that. In addition then to the horrifying incidents of actual violence against various communities, we received a number of reports of social media posts which falsely claimed to show evidence of current incidents of racial abuse against certain communities, but tended to use old footages and images from previous events. So again, creating a direct and calculated effort to sow fear and invite further confusion. Next slide, please. The other trend we saw were complaints about Mr. Zuma's arrest and detention. So there was one from the Zuma Foundation claiming that it was pure malice to incarcerate President Zuma whilst litigation on his detention without trial case was ongoing. And of course that was just false, but again it speaks to and fits into the kind of political discourse at the time. Then there was another one where they were talking about Larry Swart claiming without evidence that President Ramaphosa had paid Deputy Chief Justice Zondo 50 million rand to prosecute Zuma. So again, those kinds of things that border on the outrageous and clearly false are things that just feed into that sense of anxiety and that sense of anger and helplessness and confusion, etc., which is clearly an attempt, again, by various entities to encourage people to not know what's going on, to panic, etc. Next slide, please. So those are some of the key trends that we saw. And I guess what we move into now is how we deal with and how we look at and address these issues relating to disinformation and online incitement. And we know that they present significant threats to human rights and to democratic principles. There's no doubt about that, right? Disinformation, we know, is not a new thing. It's a very old, it's been practiced for centuries. But what is new about disinformation is that the ability to spread it and the ease in which people can do it and the scale at which people can do it and use the technology to spread disinformation and incitement is that something we've never been able to conceive of before, and we know from around the world the kind of impact that this kind of thing can have. We saw in the Capitol the riots in the United States in January in 2021, just what happens when you let that kind of thing ramble on, and when you then see it further incited by a lunatic out of touch with reality former president. We also know that dealing with disinformation and online incitement present some of the biggest challenges in terms of policy and practical responses. They sound like easy things on a level, but actually trying to deal with them is incredibly difficult and really, really challenging, precisely because they skirt on the edges of media freedom and balancing all these other rights. So in a complicated world of diverse views and competing interests, identifying and agreeing on what kind of speech are harmful or justifiable can be a notoriously difficult task. Already, as you can see, there's a lot of anger and confusion and concern at the moment about Russia Today or Russia TV. I forget if it's RT television service, the Russian state TV service, and whether or not that should be banned or removed or whatever, and there are a whole range of complex arguments that fit into that, and obviously ideological positions. So this is one of the most difficult areas, and it's also certainly not unique to us. At the same time, we also want to make sure that we really emphasize just how dangerous disinformation is. Sorry, next slide, please, Saint. Thank you. We emphasize just how dangerous disinformation is to democracy and our democratic states. We know, and we've seen from COVID, for example, disinformation about COVID can lead to direct loss of life. So this isn't something that oh well, it's a little bit bad and a little bit unfortunate. This is something that can lead to loss of life, which is a very real problem. In addition to that, what it does, disinformation, on a fairly fundamental basis, is it erodes people's sense of knowing what's real and what isn't. The moment people get to a point where they don't know if this is real or if that's real, they don't know if the post by the president is real, or if the post by someone pretending to be the president is real, it means they can't make an informed choice. If people are unable to make an informed choice, they're not existing in a democratic state. So the logical flow of disinformation, while it works for these scumbags and scoundrels that are busy pulling these things together, and you can see why they do it, right? Because it's very powerful. The problem is that everyone ultimately loses with disinformation because it undermines trust and credibility in all key institutions. It undermines trust and credibility. If we look at what happened in the lead up to the local government elections last year, we saw various political parties attacking and seeking to undermine the credibility of our constitutional court. They were saying, the ANC has already determined what the outcome will be so that they can delay the election so that they can do this and this and this. And then you saw them saying, these and these parties have influenced the IEC so that this and this and this can happen, right? That effort to undermine the credibility of institutions doesn't just undermine that institution, it undermines all of our institutions, including institutions like the South African Human Rights Commission, which is there by definition to protect and promote our rights in South Africa. So disinformation poses such a fundamental threat to our state and our institutions and the public as a public harm. It can polarize debates, create or deepen tensions in society, undermine electoral processes, and impair freedom of opinion and expression. We saw how disinformation, we've seen, again, not just locally, we've seen around the world how disinformation campaigns linked to harassment are used to silence and censor journalists, again, around the world. Very often women, they'll use misogyny in order to attack, demean, undermine them. Suggestive or inflammatory content is dangerous, and there's a fine line between content being inflammatory and content being incitement, and often such content encourages or enables disinformation to be spread. So the thing about disinformation and why Real 411 deals with 4 online harms is because very often disinformation travels with incitement. It travels with hate speech. It's a very nice way of using disinformation. If you can tie in elements of hate speech, we must get rid of all the foreigners because they steal our women, they rape our children. You know, those kinds of things. You use xenophobia and racism with disinformation that has an even greater sense of power. And some of the messages we saw clearly in the July unrest were very much of that ilk, using different things, using racism, which again isn't to deny those existing tensions. And that's one of the reasons why disinformation is so powerful, precisely because it has a grain of truth in it, right? It goes into something and then it just opens that chasm. It's like you can, if you've been pricked with a little drawing pin, you go in there and you take a big panga to it and you tear it apart, is what a disinformation does. Next slide, please. Thank you. When we look at the responses to harmful speech, so we say, okay, we know it's a problem and we have to do something about it. What are the responses? So technology is brilliant, obviously, in many respects, and you can use AI, so artificial intelligence, to go through the billions and billions of posts to help filter and remove certain kinds of content. And that is something that all of the major platforms actively use all the time, right? But the problem with that is it runs the risk of limiting freedom of expression. It runs the risk of error, of censoring things that shouldn't necessarily be censored. We know that, for example, there was the bare breast issue that was on Facebook, where, about mothers and breastfeeding and all these sorts of things, and it was removed because it was considered to be pornographic, when of course it clearly wasn't in those particular contexts. There was the story of one of the most famous pictures of all time of a girl who had been whose skin was on fire from a napalm bomb in Vietnam, running down the road, and that was removed from Facebook because it was considered to be child sexual abuse material, when of course it was one of the most famous news pictures ever taken. So that's a problem with that. There's a legal answer, which of course is good, and we need that. The problem with the legal response to dealing with harmful speech is it's necessarily slow, it's resource intensive, and it's usually reserved for the most egregious forms of speech. So we've seen our Constitutional Court just recently hand down judgment in the Masuku matter around hate speech, because it seized, like, there were about 15 organizations involved in that case, including us, and and all of the Concord judges, our finest minds, seized with working out how to draw the line and deal with some of these issues. So that is an answer, but it's not going to address what happens in a time of crisis, because that particular case originated, I think it was from speech in 2016, and so 6 years later, technology, just about everything has changed. There are proactive responses like Real 411, which is cheap. It can mitigate the harm that is caused, but it's not there to charge those people that are behind the accounts. We've got no power, we're an NGO, and there's also no guarantee that the platforms will act as we request them to. So one of the challenges, and that we're going to be asking the Human Rights Commission to look into, is when you engage with the platforms, to help us set up a mechanism that can ensure that they do act as these things go on. So I'll give you a practical example, because if we find disinformation around COVID at the moment on Real 411, and we report it to the platform and ask them to take it down, if it's particularly egregious, they'll say sure, and it gets removed, right? When it came time to some of the posts that were from Real 411 in the July Unrest, and we said, this is problematic, it needs to be removed, they came back and they said no, they couldn't, right? And their response to it was, well, this looks to be some kind of an internal conflict and a more of a he said, she said scenario, which of course it wasn't, but as a big global behemoth outside of our context and outside of understanding what's going on, you can to a degree understand how they don't want to get themselves involved in something where it could come back to bite them, right? So you can imagine if this was in Eswatini, and there they said to the platforms, you need to take these posts down, and they were just posts about people wanting to protest, that we would agree with the platforms that they shouldn't take them down, encouraging people to protest. But here, in our context, we don't have that same scenario where we do have high levels of freedom of expression. We do have all sorts of other structures in place, including bodies like the Human Rights Commission, to make sure that any request that would come from a formal structure wouldn't be done in order to censor, but it's done in order to mitigate harm. There are other internal mechanisms that the platforms have. The problem with those is that they really aren't clear. They have differing standards, and again, the biggest problem with them is they're outside of our borders. You report something to any of those platforms, your content leaves, you don't know usually what happens to it, you don't know when something will happen, etc., etc. What we also need to be doing seriously is focusing on building a democratic culture to build trust. And we have to find ways of there being an incredibly high political cost to public office bearers who disseminate disinformation. It's akin to them going in and setting Parliament on fire. There needs to be a massive cost to them for doing that. Of course, there isn't as yet. Next slide, please. The good news, I suppose, is that these are global challenges. We've seen the USA leading on this in many respects. They've already had 2 or 3 special committees set up to deal with the role that social media plays and that mis and disinformation play. Most recently, their response to the Capitol riots was a committee appointed by the House of Representatives, and they brought in all of the various players and asked them what they were doing, find out what mechanisms they were pursuing. The European Parliament Special Committee on Foreign Interference in All Democratic Processes, what a fabulous name, whose mandate includes responding to disinformation, held hearings with senior representatives of, again, the major platforms to find out how they're responding to these particular threats. Locally, our own government had established a multi-stakeholder working group to look at mis and disinformation and malinformation. I think that process is currently stalled, but again, it is a really important and critically positive process that they were pursuing. But we would strongly request the South African Human Rights Commission engage directly with the platforms to gain an insight into their responses, systems and plans for future times of crisis in South Africa. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? Next slide, please. The first thing we're recommending, clearly and unambiguously, is a rights-based approach. Good thing that the South African Human Rights Commission is going to be adopting one, because I think it would be a problem if they didn't. So a rights-based approach we think is essential because any approach that seeks to undermine human rights is going to be short-sighted, counterproductive, and we should avoid it at all costs. There's been a view that it's because we have too many rights that we have too many problems in South Africa. And that view kind of dissolves, and we hear it across different formats where one of the reasons some people argue that we have such high levels of gender-based violence is because women have too many rights. Right? I mean, it's just utterly moronic. But freedom of expression and access to information are not part of the problem. They're the objective and the means for combating disinformation. So again, it comes back to that idea that I spoke about at the start, about needing to find a balance. Freedom of expression is of the utmost importance in a kind of open democratic society and constitution. They're indispensable facilitators of a vigorous and necessary exchange of ideas and accountability. And I guess part of when we think about this, what we need to be cautious of is that unfortunately we do need to hear things that we don't like. We do need to hear speech that we strongly disagree with, speech that upsets us, that even angers us, right? We should be upset and angered on a daily basis, just looking at all of the challenges that we face in South Africa. So it's not to suggest that freedom of expression can only be nice. It can and it should be provocative and difficult. But there's a difference between that, obviously, and disinformation and other forms of harmful speech. We also can't forget that in as much as much of my presentation is focused on the negative side of social media, there's also a lot that the internet can and has done to accelerate access to information and freedom of expression. It can be an incredibly powerful tool to hold public officials accountable, and it can enable greater transparency and allow people to exercise their constitutional rights. We know, for example, that it's allowed people to capture and report real-time abuses or other forms of executive overreach. We've seen a number of cases in South Africa where, were it not for someone standing there with a mobile device and they didn't capture it, that we may not have seen it. There was that famous case of that man whose name I've forgotten to my embarrassment, who was videoed. The police were dragging him behind a bakkie. That was a cell phone video that was then used as a front page story of the Daily Sun, and that resulted in a whole lot of action in relation to that. So it can and does play an incredibly positive role, so we can't forget that. We must work out ways of enhancing that. And that was, even in the unrest, there was some examples of how social media helped encourage people to know what was going on. It helped alert people to certain things, areas to avoid, but also it helped ultimately when the cleanup started. Social media was one of the ways it spread, and so we can't forget that. Next slide, please. The other critical thing we need to avoid are knee-jerk responses, and these, while understandable, are really not the way to go. So criminalizing disinformation is not a viable solution. Anywhere where this has been tried in the world and where it is being done in the world, it results in fundamentally unacceptable incursions into rights to freedom of expression. Similarly, shutting down the internet or social media platforms is against the law. Any country that does that, they've got a lot more to hide than what they're saying. When we saw it tragically in Eswatini, where it was used there to quell and to deny people what was going on and to deny freedom of expression. And tragically, some of our local mobile operators acceded to the requests to shut down the internet. It's a bad idea and we shouldn't do it, and it doesn't solve any of the problems. All it does is it leaves people in the dark, especially at a time of unrest. So what we can do, next slide, please. Thank you, Saints. All efforts to address disinformation and incitement must fall within the dictates of our Constitution and must be grounded firmly in international human rights law, including respect for freedom of expression and access to information. Responses from social media platforms, the government and stakeholders must be guided by appropriate protections of freedom of expression, inclusivity and minimization of online harm. Any limitation of the right to freedom of expression must be narrowly circumscribed in accordance with Section 36 of our Constitution. We're also recommending that any measures proposed must be cognizant of and give appropriate effect to the nuances and right to express an opinion without censorship or restraint. Any criminal sanctions for speech risk having a chilling effect on the exercise of the right to freedom of expression and must be approached with heightened caution. Authorized internet shutdowns as a means of combating disinformation is unlawful and should never be a response by states in the ordinary course, and more importantly in a time of crisis. When you're in a crisis, you need more information, more accurate, credible information, not less. And the principles of openness and accountability must further inform efforts to address disinformation and incitement and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. Next slide, please. So in terms of our recommendations for how we can combat these things in the future, we say that you have to have a multi-stakeholder approach for the simple reason that the nature of disinformation and the nature of the challenge goes well beyond the power, scope, interest, and capability of any one or two groups. You can't leave it up to the platforms to solve, because they don't. They wouldn't have done anything had it not been from massive pressure from the government. Similarly, you can't just leave it up to states, just because the world over, if they do it, they will use it to abuse freedom of expression and impose censorship. You just need the police services. You need all sorts of other services. You need your other emergency services involved. You might need your social development. You might need communications. There's justice. There's all sorts of entities that need to get involved. And of course, you need the Human Rights Commission in that instance to investigate rights abuses, as you're doing now. So just as the violence requires a multi-stakeholder approach and multi-dimensional response, so too does dealing with disinformation and harmful speech. Next slide, please. The good news is there are already a number of lessons we can learn from other successful approaches. Ongoing communication. One of the biggest problems that we saw in the unrest was the failure by various bodies, governments and non-government alike, to communicate what the hell was going on. It was only when media started to get there and send all of their people to wherever they could get them to that we started to get a better sense of what was going on. But then again, we needed issues to be communicated. We needed to know what was happening. As a result, there was a clear sense, both real and imagined, that the state had no answer to anything. Right? The police were nowhere to be found. Intelligence services were nowhere to be found, and to varying degrees these things are true, of course, but a critical area that has to be addressed for any future crisis is urgent, ongoing, up-to-date, rapid communication. We've seen the critical importance of that with COVID, and if we don't learn from that, we're going to just see further loss of life. Now, we know that government has seen the importance of a national joint operation and intelligence structure, and that's called NatJoints, right? That's already an operational arm of the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security Cluster. So NatJoints is there, and its mandate is to plan, implement, execute and monitor all interdepartmental and cross-provincial operations affecting safety, security and stability in our country. I don't know what happened with NatJoints in this instance, and I'm sure you've had input on this, but we know that this is already an existing approach that is there to deal with, on-the-ground things, that, the actual violence, etc. We know that it includes the SAPS, the SANDF, NDMC, and various members of relevant government departments. It's a grouping of senior representatives, as well as other required role players and state-owned entities who are tasked to manage, designated or unexpected events or situations in the safety and security sphere. Now, we know that NatJoint has previously adopted multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder responses. If you look at their response to the rural safety issue, that's what they did. They adopted that, they can do it. So there's precedent already for NatJoints to adopt a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approach. We submit that NatJoint is well placed to incorporate a rapid information and communications task team. Next slide, please. Why do we need a rapid information communications task team? Because you need up-to-date information. You need risk communication strategies. You've got to be getting messages out that can clearly say these and these things are going on, these and these things aren't going on. This is where you can go for water. This is where you can go and get these things. Like basic communications has to be there and has to be a part of it to help mitigate mis and disinformation. One of the things we know about disinformation is it thrives, just go mad or whatever they want to do. You have to be able to communicate with them. You have to be able to communicate calmly, rationally, de-escalate violence down. Because we haven't had an RICTT, I think has been an abject failure. It's probably one of the most egregious failures over the... We need an independent rights-based approach, right? And that's why we argue that you need the cool heads of an entity like the South African Human Rights Commission. What you don't want is the police saying, oh, don't worry, we'll run the RICTT. We can do it, you know, we've got comms people. Yes, of course they can, but they're the police, right? Their perspective on it is very different to someone and a body and an entity whose mandate is protecting human rights. You need to let the SAPS do what they're really good at, go there, police, you know, to make sure that there's peace and safety and stability. Send in their messages to this thing, but you can't leave it in the hands of the police or a single government department. It will be a disaster. So you need a multi-stakeholder approach to learn and to cover all areas, from South African government bodies and platforms and civil society, and of course the media need to be involved in this. To succeed, that's what you have to do. Talk all the time. In short parlance, they say they need to implement a risk communication community engagement action plan. See, surprise, it's worked so well. Again, not just locally, but correct disinformation. Had we been able to, for example, to feed the content and the complaints that were coming in directly into this RICTT, it would have meant that the South African Human Rights Commission could have said, right, we see this is what's going on. We need to get out and get ahead of this. We see that there's potential violence in this community. We need to alert the police that they can go there, that they can respond, that they can show that there's a presence there. We need to be communicating about this and this and this. We need to, there's race is being clearly used as a leverage to, you know, stir hatred. Let's remind everyone why we are the country that we are, etc., right? You need to be able to do those things. And that's what an RCCE strategy does. Next slide, please. So what we're suggesting is that NatJoint incorporates an RIS as a rapid information communications task team. Our submission is that this information and incitement, so that you get your security clusters there as NatJoints, and then you've got an entity in a body that isn't going to encourage overreach or overstretch into, or unnecessary incursion into freedom of expression. Because again, if you go to the SANDF and you say, what's the best way of clamping down on disinformation, they'll say, shut down the internet, right? Because that's the army, their job, defend, go in, and that's their thinking, which is fair and fine for the military. It's not the approach we need as a country. Doesn't suggest that the military doesn't have a key role, etc., but you need a body that is seized, that understands the importance of balancing rights, and that is independent, especially if its duty is to deal with that fine art of balancing rights. But the SAHRC leads that. You're the point of coordination and communication, and that you provide guidance to NatJoint on these issues. It's fair, it's clear, it's obvious. You know, we're doing some of this stuff with children on a regular basis anyway, but it is essential in a democratic state that everyone has these new life skills to critically engage with the content especially in a time of crisis, because when people are fearful and they are anxious, they're a lot more susceptible to mis and disinformation. That's when you need all of the public to be going, okay, let's just take a deep breath, hit the pause button, and then worry about whether or not I believe this or share it, or how do I verify that this is actually true or not. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we know that social media will play a key role in the next crisis we face. There's no doubt about that, right? The question is are we going to be ready for it? Are we going to make the same mistakes that we made in the July unrest? Are more people going to die as a result of our failure to act and put structures in place now? So, we really do request that the SAHRC look into this, adopt this as an approach to say, aside from all of the other elements of this, but to say, how do we put structures in place that we can prevent this kind of thing happening, that as it starts to unfold the next time, we can mitigate and minimize the harm that's caused. That's how we build our culture of human rights. Next slide, please. And that's my formal presentation done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Saint.
Mr. Bird, for really a very interesting presentation with clear recommendations. We really appreciate that approach from your side. Over to the evidence team for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, Mr. Bird.
Good morning.
Mr. Bird, I'm going to be asking you a series of questions primarily around two themes. So firstly, we're going to focus on the broad role of media in society, and then secondly, we'll discuss how to hold the media accountable. I think before we turn to that, I'm just going to ask you two brief questions around context. Let's remember that, there's people at home who want to be able to follow the conversation. So my first question to you would be, what do you understand the primary role of media to be in an era of mass disinformation? What are the obligations attached to that?
Sure, that's a big question. I mean, look, there tend to be three approaches to the role of a media in society. And when we talk about the media in that instance, very often we kind of conflating journalism and the media. Because, of course, the media now has to include social media. So the media generally, right, if you talk about it, one of the most powerful approaches is that what it does is it serves to reinforce and represent power dynamics that exist in society. So stories that make the news agenda are, news media only have space for a fixed number of stories or resources for a fixed number of stories. Of all of the stories that are happening, they're choosing 10 of them. So we report on Russia and the Ukraine, even though it's thousands of miles away from us. Why do we report on it? Because it impacts balance of power, it impacts the oil price, it impacts the rand, etc., etc. So there are a number of reasons that editors and journalists around the world make on a daily basis to say this is going to make our news, this is going to make our news, and this isn't going to make the news. So the role of it in that instance is that it serves to inform people, but it also serves to represent the power dynamics that exist in society. So when we see that there are only 19% of women in society, I mean, in the media, it talks to how power is reflected in our society. Now, mass media, and we talk about that, we talk about traditional journalistic media. I think we need to just say the role of media in a crisis, and when I talk about that, in this instance, I'm talking about traditional media that are there for news, that adhere to journalistic principles and standards, as opposed to social media, which has a whole range of other things. But social media doesn't build community, it's not there to necessarily inform, it's there to sell us to advertisers fundamentally, whereas news media is there to help us understand what's going on.
Thanks for that. I'm going to test some of those definitions with you later.
Lovely.
But I think for purpose of consistency, can we get some clarity around the terms that you use? So perhaps, speak to the Commission about what is the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And then if you could also give us a concise definition of, what constitutes traditional or mainstream media on one hand versus the term you use, which is social media. I think once we have parameters around those concepts, we can jump into the thematic discussion.
So there isn't really an accepted, as far as I'm aware, definition of mis and disinformation. There seem to be some things starting to be emerging now. So you will know that we're currently under the Disaster Management Act, and there's a regulation that where our government has sought to define disinformation as intentional spreading of a falsehood, spreading of a falsehood with intent to deceive a person, right? We talk about mis and disinformation, and I think the more perhaps well-known definition is that misinformation is when you spread false information without intention. So, for example, your mother sends, or your father sends you something that is clearly that says that President Ramaphosa has resigned, and you go, oh my goodness, and I share that. That's sharing misinformation. So there's no intent. If, however, you have intent in creating that, then it becomes disinformation, because there's something a bit more sinister to that. We, on a practical basis and for the purposes of Real 411, look at, because you're not able to easily determine intent, what we look at is false information that has the potential, or that has the likelihood of causing public harm. So if you spread something false that has the likelihood of causing public harm, then it can be disinformation. And then your second question, on mainstream media, there traditionally that means your broadcasters, your print, and now they're your kind of online media. So there I'm referring to established media entities and entities that work according to agreed or internationally or even just locally recognized principles of doing journalism, versus social media, where each of those media may use social media as a platform, but social media doesn't have any of those desires. You can publish pictures of children riding dinosaurs, and that's no problem. It's not there to put out news and information that can help us understand the world.
Thank you. I think you've equally addressed my following question around, what constitutes mainstream media and social media. But would you incorporate something like community radio into your definition of mainstream media? Is your mic on?
Sorry, community radio gets a license from the Independent Communications Authority, and part of getting a license means you have to subscribe to the Broadcast Complaints Commission. Similarly, if you start, even if you're a small one-person online newspaper or actual physical newspaper in a small community that the MDDA funds, for example, you would adhere to accepted standards of journalism. You'll probably be signed up to the Press Council. There are some notable exceptions like the Independent, which isn't, and that's one of the reasons why they're a problem.
Mr. Bird, you addressed us at length earlier around the use of social media as a tool for incitement, and you took us through some examples of how that played out on the ground during the July unrest. Just based on your experience and in your own words, why do you think social media is a useful tool for peddling incitement and inciting and inflammatory content?
I guess there are a couple of reasons. One is because anyone in this room with a device, a mobile device, it doesn't even have to be an expensive one, is able to create that kind of content if you have access to the internet as well, which is obviously essential for this. As long as you've got that, you can create content. And the moment you have that, I don't have to subscribe to the press council. So if I want to make a story up, you know, that I drove here in a Lamborghini and I crashed into a Maserati, I can say that. Of course, none of it's got anything vaguely to do with reality, but I can say that. So your ability to create content is now easier than ever before, is the first thing. The second thing is that social media works on how easy you are to sell to audiences. So the algorithms that promote and go viral and the things that people view tend to be things that resonate and have an emotional response. So things that are dull and often truthful and factual and boring, like this is how a vaccine actually works, right? That may be very technical, are things that aren't going to elicit a very strong emotional response unless you're a scientist or a biochemist who gets excited about these things, right? But with social media, the things that people know go viral are things that push buttons, are things that they know that if they say, let's get rid of all the foreigners, it's often, that's the second thing is that it's very easy to use and to stimulate and encourage emotion, and social media feeds deliberately off that. The more angry you can make people, the more anxious, the more likely they are to share that, right? So it's not just happy smiley cat videos, it's videos that will make you go, oh, this is terrible, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do. Those kinds of things, that content spreads. The third thing about what makes it so powerful to spread disinformation is that it's very easy to add a grain of truth to whatever you're doing and then take it into a different kind of a realm. So they will say, you know, foreigners are raping our women. And of course, there will be stories of some non-South African person who has been charged with rape. We know this, right? But you tie it into an idea that it's all these foreigners that come here to rape our women. And if you then link it to a picture which is very easy to do, then it becomes even easier. The fourth reason why it's so powerful for helping and spreading mis and disinformation is its networking ability and the ease in which you can develop a strategy to spread content. So it's not just me. I can then go and set up a whole lot of accounts. I can even buy bot farms, or I can buy accounts literally that have got thousands of followers. Or I can pay people even to sit behind, pretend to be people and tweet or post content on the various platforms to pretend to be someone else, so that I game the algorithm, so that if I want to start spreading a rumor, I get all of these followers together, and then at the correct time I say, okay, go. And I'll push my button, and all of my bots will start reposting, retweeting, liking, resharing that. And of course, the algorithms on these on the systems go, oh look, this is starting to go up, and then it means suddenly it goes outside of that network, and you'll suddenly start seeing this, and you'll be thinking, oh my goodness, right? And what that does is it's then easy to shift the narrative. The fifth reason that social media is so good is that it's completely destroyed our existing power dynamics of the media, of what the media is and what it does, right? Because we used to rely on the news media to tell us what was going on. You know, it used to be determined, so your point of access wasn't, how do I stop all of the noise and find something that's true? Your point was, okay, let me find out what has actually been going on. Whereas now, because they've completely challenged that power dynamic, it means that your sources of news are now just about everywhere. So being able to discern what's credible and what isn't is incredibly challenging and very difficult. And that links to the last reason, which is that we haven't been building on and engineering into our educational system and into our basic contracts when you get a cell phone contract, key life lessons around digital literacy that tell people this is how you're going to tell what's real and what isn't, this is how you know what's credible and what isn't, and these are the steps you can take to make those decisions. Without those things, you're then speaking to a susceptible public, you're speaking to a public that's there, and I guess I said the last reason, but actually the last reason is because, you know, we live in a world that's incredibly polarized. And with all that information, that's almost like the nature of it, is that you're wanting to know what the latest is. There's this anxiety around making sure that you're keeping up with things, and just that basic feeling and that sense of everything that is out there further helps contribute to spreading and creating mis and disinformation.
Can we then pivot onto a similar footed theme? I think we've discussed at length the role of social media in the context of the July unrest. But I'd invite you at this point to speak to us about the role of mainstream media in the July unrest. Was it completely benign? Was its conduct completely blameless? And was everything that was shared verified? From your presentation, it was evident to us that Real 411 monitors social media activity, but we're quite interested in then who holds traditional media to account.
So we haven't completed our analysis of that actually, but what we do know is that at the time, what it showed up was just how gutted our mainstream media are. Because I'm sure you've heard all of your other people speaking to you before this, the violence started, and it was hours before we could get any of that actually verified on a legitimate, credible mainstream media house. Not even the SABC, which is the biggest media house in the country, was able to say, yes, this is happening, or no, this is not. You know, you had to get them out there to do that, and that showed the time it took for them to catch up, to get their people down to the various places. I think speaks to how gutted our media are in terms of being able to have reporters on the ground. They should have had reporters in those communities, and the reality is for the most part, they just weren't there. And that, I think, is a real challenge for our media sector, because when you see things going on in places and communities that are outside of your immediate main urban centers, our media has a very real problem in trying to cover that. That said, once they did start covering that, the majority of the media that we've observed certainly made sure that they verified what was going on beforehand. The videos that they carried, they tried to verify. We saw some really exciting and innovative approaches to trying to tell the story as it was unfolding, in terms of this is where the violence started, this is what it's looking like, this is where it's going. And then, of course, they started to do what they always do, is just go to the official sources to find out what was going on. If you say, did they do enough to help de-escalate the violence? You know, they would probably argue that that's not their job to de-escalate the violence, but in our view, if you're going to protect a constitutional democracy, it probably is to certainly make it clear that violence is to be condemned. Then I'm not so sure. Some media we know, like independent media, with some of their headlines and stories about the president and about former President Zuma, I think would be considered to be either misinformation or disinformation, right, to the extent that they certainly contributed to that environment of fear and anxiety. But for the most part, our media usually acquit themselves very well when it comes to a crisis, and trying to get in and get involved and report on it generally fairly.
I think then, staying on the point of accountability, I want to put certain propositions to you. The Commission received several complaints around the fact that some of the misinformation that hit the ground actually stemmed from what we would call traditional media. Yes, so people say, I saw on TV that X shopping center was burning, when in fact it actually wasn't. And you know, that kind of misinformation elicited certain responses in the community, which were naturally detrimental. So I'm going to put two statements to you, and then I hope you can, I'd love to hear your comment on it. The first is that in reality, there doesn't always seem to be a strict distinction between social media and traditional media. because sometimes we often just find a copy-paste of what was trending on social media, except it's now on a platform that promotes a form of traditional media. So this idea of a stark, bright line, is perhaps a lot more malleable than we accept. I'd love to hear your comment in respect of that. The second issue, based on the example Sure. The second issue, based on the complaint received from the Commission, is that there are certain stories or certain angles that mainstream media overlooks, and that social media is powerful in the sense that a person provides an angle that might be interesting or relevant, but that was overlooked, because somebody in mainstream media perhaps felt it wasn't interesting. And an example we've heard here is that there was a very, that patterns around the race description of the people looting was often limited to black people, when, there's allegations, there's actually information that it spread, it cut across that. So the identity of a looter was limited to one race, when, reporting around other races wasn't as reflective. So I'd also like to hear your view on how social media perhaps opens up and reflects different angles that aren't necessarily reflected in mainstream media.
So I think that, to a large degree we need to, and certainly, there was, you may be familiar that the South African National Editors Forum commissioned, it's now known as the Satchel Report, looking into media credibility issues, and there were a whole range of faults and flaws pointed out, many of which they obviously still need to address. And very often the media are their own worst enemy. They do things where they don't apply their own checks and balances. They forget, or someone does the wrong thing. So it's very, very seldom that it's intentional. But we know that the media are often their own worst enemy in terms of undermining their own credibility. As you pointed out, some of them do just take videos straight off there and they put them up without taking the time to verify them, and then they look like complete idiots when they discover that actually that video isn't true or accurate. So I think that we need to recognize the critical importance that media play in a democratic state, even more so in a time of social media, where we need to be able to say, if we get this from credible media, we know that we can rely on it for the most part to be accurate and true. If we give them that responsibility, though, which they have, they must exercise that responsibly. And to the extent that they don't always do that, I completely agree. We spend out our, we have a weekly thing where we hit media every week on instances in which they report children well and instances in which they don't report them well, where they may violate their rights. Every single week we do that, and that's on one small issue around portrayal of children. So we know that on all of these bigger issues, there are even bigger problems. They tend to focus on the major urban areas, which then feeds to your second question of undoubtedly, one of the powerful things of social media is that it can bring very different and very fresh perspectives. It means you can open up all sorts of small organizations and entities to feed it. And we're seeing these things being harnessed, right? So there's an open source network of people currently being employed in deployed or employed not as under a contract around the Ukraine to help feed into journalists to give them more accurate local on the ground information as to what the hell's going on. And so that is incredibly powerful, where it works and where it's deliberate. I don't think that we are there yet with our own media adopting similar approaches. I mean, they're starting to, but to a large degree, I don't think that we're using our audiences in the way that our media probably should.
Thank you. Mr. Bird, can I just ask perhaps that you just tilt your mic just slightly closer to you? Yeah, so we can hear you more clearly. Thank you. That's great. Sure. This is my second last question before I hand over to my colleague. And I'm sticking to the theme of accountability. My colleague is going to discuss briefly with you the range of recommendations you propose around ensuring that social media maintains a certain level of accuracy and standards. I want to stick to the conversation I'm having with you around traditional and mainstream media. In instances where those obligations are not met, and the responsibility to maintain credibility and fact-checking isn't adhered to, what kind of structures are in place for possible sanction or just possible notification of a breach of standards? And I'd also invite you to speak to the Commission around whether those structures are actually effective, when we keep in mind instances where that are common knowledge where those standards haven't been met.
So your best mechanisms locally and certainly internationally appear to be the ones that are self or co-regulatory. So our broadcast media, we've got a Broadcast Complaints Commission, and there's a code that adheres to that. So if you can frame your complaint in relation to that code, your complaint will be heard, it'll go through a fair process, etc., etc. And those things work, they've been shown to work. You can get forms of redress, and generally speaking, they are effective. Of course, where, and we've seen with the Press Council, the famous case of the rogue unit, that case was taken. The Press Council found that they hadn't done their fact-checking properly. They ruled against them. The newspaper apologized. There were all sorts of things, and then that kind of discourse continuing was clearly part of a deliberate political strategy. But the system itself worked, right? Which is to say that if people have a complaint about mainstream media, they take it, it goes through various processes, and there's an outcome, and those processes are fair. The Press Council, I think, has just now got a former retired Constitutional Court Justice, whose name I can't remember at the moment, to be their sitting appeals judge. So it's not like they don't have highly credible, intelligent, excellent people working for them. Are they always going to give us the answers that we want? No. But I think that if you look at any other kind of a structure, you're going to say, well, what is the best way around that? And if you're saying they're doing something repeatedly, the answer isn't going to lie in taking the same complaint. The answer is going to lie in saying, well, how do we fix the structures that lead to that same thing occurring again? So that's why, as an example I gave you about children, our approach is to say the media consistently or over a period of time keep repeating the same mistake. Our approach is to say we highlight when they do things well, and we highlight when they get it wrong, and we tell them what they can do differently. And that's what we do all the time in order to change that kind of overall practice. So they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think in terms of striking that balance between freedom of expression and holding media accountable, they certainly work really well. Where you've got a big problem is with a body like independent media that no longer subscribes to it, and their own internal complaints process doesn't have the credibility. And then you're getting the public going, well, if I complain to them, nothing happens.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. My final question is around the state's use of of social media and technology generally. We discussed several issues with Minister Lamola yesterday, and one of the questions put to him was that one of the reasons why the state responded so poorly to the July unrest was simply because they were confounded by the use of social media. And that much was found by the President's expert panel report, that they simply couldn't keep up with the immediate exchanges of information, and they couldn't relate to it on the ground. I would like you to speak to the Commission around whether in your work you interact with the state and are open to giving them any sort of proposals or recommendations around shoring up their use of technology in moments of unrest and social disorder. So, yeah, based on your expertise and your experience, is there a way that the state itself can claim back social media and technology and use it in a way to turn around narratives around disinformation?
Sure. The short answer is yes, obviously they can. I'm not sure how they can in the way government is currently structured. You know, one of the advantages of a lunatic president like former President Trump was that he was doing his own social media. I mean, he'd frequently post the most outrageous, offensive, sexist, racist crap, but he was there and he was communicating, and better than most people, he understood the importance of actually communicating. I don't believe that our government generally does that at all well. You know, they, for the most part, they will try. Sometimes there will be really good campaigns, but certainly in a time of crisis, they don't and they can't. So if you look at it, so the work and our direct experience of this has been with the Department of Health around COVID. So you've got people that are working, you know, they're working 18-hour days. So it's not like they're sitting there twiddling their thumbs in their comms, but you'll find that the way that government works and the structures, for them to make a decision about, can we put out this message, can we do this and this and this, they'll go, okay, well, yes, we need to write it down. Okay, we're going to have a task team meeting about that next week, and then we'll discuss it and we'll get agreement from them. From them it goes to the DG, from the DG it'll go or to the DDG, then the DG, and then to the minister, and then it gets approved, and then we'll come back to you on that. And by then, that message is long gone, right? So just the inherent structure of government as it stands really does prohibit urgent, critically fast and speedy responses to crises. You know, it took them months before they were able, and maybe that's because the people from Digital Vibe stole the money, but it took them months before they were able to get any of their real campaigns going, and they relied heavily on the private and the NGO sector to be putting out consistent positive messages about COVID, about vaccines, just because their structures are not structures that are engineered to deliver things quickly and urgently. So when you get to a crisis, it's no wonder that they can't actually respond. Not because I don't think that they've got the capability or good people that can do these things in many instances, but because their structures prohibit them from doing that. Which is why our recommendation speaks directly to having a rapid information task team, you know, communication task team, because government, for the most part, aren't, their systems don't allow them to do that. Sometimes it's about competition, sometimes it's about ego, sometimes it's because they've been burnt by bad experiences where they've let you know, one of their spokespeople say things and they get themselves into trouble. You know, so I think that they've tried various things, but for me, it's a crucial area that our government, all of our departments, has to improve on dramatically, because when they also see communication, as we'll tell you, not engaging in what we're doing now. You ask, I respond. You comment, you know, like government communications very often doesn't work like that. It'll be you'd ask a question, I'd say, and you'd go next thing. And that's, I think, is a problem. So the Human Rights Commission could ask them to address that fundamentally, because that is a very real challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. Chairperson, I'm going to hand over to my colleague to carry on questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. I only have a couple of questions. I was going to spend some time speaking about some of the recommendations you proposed, but I think you addressed it substantively in the written submission, and in your presentation you were also able to touch on it for the benefit of the public, so I'm not going to rehash those points. I wanted to maybe ask about, you spoke about the fluidity that still surrounds clear definitions between misinformation and disinformation. And at one point you also touched on the importance of trust, that that can intervene in where we go to verify specific kind of information as truth. I think you also made mention of the fact that a high proliferation of accurate information also tempers the movement of disinformation and misinformation online. I wanted to maybe ask about this question of narrative by traditional media and where that fits in, because sometimes the mistrust originates from at least the public's perception about how editorial rooms shape narratives, what they choose to report in, what stories get major airtime and what stories doesn't. So where does the editorial decisions and narratives that are shaped by powerful media houses, where does that fit in thinking about this ecosystem of disinformation, misinformation, and so forth?
So, I mean, so the fundamental threat that disinformation poses is about undermining trust and credibility of key public institutions. And just as human rights work in a way that you can't cherry pick them to have a human rights system, right? You can't say, we're only going to talk about dignity and equality and to hell with everything else, right? That system will soon fall apart, right? You have to say, how do we balance all of these things in some kind of equilibrium, understanding that, as our Constitution says, which I have with me, given our past and history, dignity, our founding values, dignity and equality, right? In the same way as all of those things work together, every institution that's part of a democratic structure has to work to strengthen the other institutions, or they necessarily ultimately undermine the democratic system itself. So the media is a critical part of that. The courts, the IEC, the justice system outside of the courts, the state, parliament. Unfortunately, the last decade, 2 decades, we've seen Parliament behaving pitifully. I mean, the fact that it burnt down was symptomatic of how disgracefully Parliament has behaved as a general rule across so many issues and areas. They've undermined people's trust and faith in the state and in government and in MPs actually knowing anything beyond how to game the system to get money for travel. Beyond that, right? So they've undermined the democratic system fundamentally. Similarly, media, in many instances, their own worst enemy. For far too long, they haven't taken their audiences on board as terms of something to help nourish and help bring the public onto their side. They've continued that approach of speaking down to them instead of communicating with them. And in addition to that, we've got high levels of media concentration in South Africa, and they tend to operate and tend to speak to the same kinds of audiences. And that does create fundamental biases in narratives. So that the kind of things that miss out on that is, if you're not in Gauteng, the Western Cape or KZN, chances are your provinces generally are going to get very little coverage, right? So if you are one of the people that are living in the Eastern Cape and you're thinking, why do they ever report this? Those stories don't get told. They might get told by your local media, but by and large, they're not being told. So there's no doubt that there are those kinds of problems, all of them exacerbated, of course, by social media and what it's doing and how it's wrecking their models. Because the reality is you need a journalist to be in the community, to hear and understand the community, to have relationships with all of the local key people. Because had we had those, we would have known months ahead what was coming, right? And we didn't. So there is a real problem, and our media are aware of this. The ones that, it's not like they don't know this. It's not like they're just out there to go after people. And we're seeing various efforts to address that and to change that. It's why you need your community media to be doing the things that they're doing. We've got to find ways to make them more sustainable, etc. And I think that they are very often their own worst enemy, and they do play into those ideas that they're pursuing a particular narrative or particular series or set of facts. But then again, we don't get anyone coming out and actively supporting them or offering something that's different to that. And the problem, as I said, is that trust in the democratic system, each institution has to help buffer the other. So what we would like to see is when the IEC is attacked, it can't just be the IEC who says, no, we're not biased or whatever. Where, of course, it's true, that must be exposed, right? So if someone in in the Human Rights Commission's guilty of corruption, they must be exposed, they must be kicked out, no doubt. But if people are just going around attacking the integrity of the Human Rights Commission, we need the IEC, we need the presidency, we need all people coming out and saying no. You don't just attack it. If there's merit, by all means, and it's the same thing with the media, because we have to try and build that kind of democratic consensus, that democratic idea and that culture of human rights, which I think is so fundamental, because once we start to do that, we start to encourage greater trust and credibility in our media. But also, if you look at the evidence from the various, so there's something called the Reuters Journalism Institute, I think it is. I can find that and send it on to the Commission afterwards. So there's pieces by Reuters journalism, and there's some Edelsman trust barometers. Our media are actually a lot more trusted than people think that they are. It's always convenient and nice to attack the media because they often expose things people don't want to do. But without them, we wouldn't, the State Capture Commission wouldn't have happened. Our president probably wouldn't have been, our former president probably wouldn't have been put on trial. All sorts of things we just wouldn't, we simply wouldn't know about. So there's no doubt that our media play a critical role. The last point I want to add on this is that one of the key things that's central to building that trust and credibility is having a strong, independent, credible public broadcaster. You can't undermine the importance of that as an institution, for the simple reason that unlike News 24 or Arena Group or the Mail and Guardian or any of these other media houses that are there, that have to make some kind of commercial success of it, the public broadcaster is there to reflect the views, stories, ideas, etc. of everyone in South Africa. It's a massive mandate. Where their trust and credibility is low and where things get undermined in a public broadcaster, that's where you have a major problem in trust and credibility with all of your media. So if you look at some of at many of the northern Scandinavians, where they have the highest levels of trust is in their public broadcaster, because they know that they're there for the people, they're there to report on things that speak to them. And again, our history, save for the last 5 years of the current board and senior executives, a history of the SABC since democracy has been one of direct interference. So you've had active efforts to undermine the credibility and trust of the SABC that reached its zenith under Hlaudi Motsoeneng and the board and Parliament. All of them failed embarrassingly, despicably, disgustingly in their mandate of that. So you've then been rebuilding the credibility of the SABC, and you're doing it in a time where everyone's got low levels of trust in every public institution, because our government has consistently failed the people of South Africa. The courts consistently fail, like every institution on so many levels has consistently failed the people of South Africa. So in that context, it's not surprising that people then say, oh, well, the media are just as bad, right? To a degree they are, but to a greater degree their role is absolutely essential and overwhelmingly positive.
Thank you for that. In fact, you spoke to the next question that I was going to address, which is the state broadcaster and obviously privately owned media and how we think about their role. Just to put you in context, this theme of the media is important for our investigation in thinking about the July unrest, because we've had government officials, almost all of them, telling us that something like this will happen again. And then we have experts telling us that online disinformation was a contributing factor. And as you know, everywhere in the world, from election interfering to insurrections have happened as a result of the possibility of the media. But keeping on this theme of misinformation and disinformation, obviously the misinformation and disinformation is prior to the question of who has access to information. You were speaking about different reporting being filtered depending on where you stay. And I'll combine the issues, then you can maybe comment on both of them. The one about paywalls, you know, one would think that during a July unrest, where we don't know what's going on in the country, that there's a higher duty to value the ability to give information from multiple trusted sources as opposed to using it as an event for higher advertising and so forth. So can you comment maybe on, and maybe this can be part of the recommendation, do you think that there should be a standard of when there's a higher democratic duty regarding the provision of information during times where the country is going through a critical event? Do you think that paywalls and advertising are one of the places at which interventions and regulations can come under?
So if you look at COVID, what we saw with COVID was that almost all of our media houses, I'm trying to think of one that didn't actually, that do have paywalls, made their COVID coverage free, even some of the big international ones, like The Economist and the New York Times, I think for a time did it. You know, so big media brands, global ones and local ones, their COVID coverage was free. So their response to the COVID crisis, I think, also has been broadly, you know, that we should be applauding and commending the media for the way that they responded to the COVID crisis. I mean, of course there are issues with it, but we did see that they made every effort to ensure that their content could be disseminated. We saw the public broadcaster, you know, setting up an education channel so that children who don't have access to the internet could watch TV and learn from home. You know, we saw them producing radio public service announcements. We saw endless hours of you know, talk shows and programming being set aside deliberately to inform and educate people about it. So the precedent is there. What's missing from this is that there was no plan. You know, there was no RICTT for this event, and there hasn't been one for any of the kind of events that have happened. We've relied on the goodwill and the amazingness of so many of our people, because they are amazing people, to be doing amazing things in a time of crisis. But imagine how much better it would be if we actually had a proper plan in place, so that we say, when the next kind of unrest or something similar to this happens, we've got a plan where we'll go to the SABC and say, right, this is what we have, this is what's happening, this is what we know. We need to be putting out these and these public service messages. They say, off we go. They'll go and craft them themselves, because you're not interfering in the editorial process, and they can go. And you bring in that's why media, as we've said, is part of our recommendation. They must be part of that planning process, so that they know what's going on, and they can say, this is what we're going to do, these are the messages that we can start getting involved in, and that we can start disseminating, because they are, you know, so again, that's not as part of them reporting on that they must do. They must go and find people that are, you know, doing things, police that are involved in the looting themselves, for example. They must do that. But equally, they do have a role to play, and I think that for the most part, they'd be very willing to say, if we can help put out accurate, credible information that can help people not panic, that can help people know where to go and where to get things, that for the most part they would accept that as part of their civil duty. And we've seen that they do that under COVID, where they all had, you know, they all went to town on COVID stuff, not just because it was the biggest news story, but because they realized and acknowledged their role. You know, so even the mobile operators said, okay, we'll whitelist these and these sites so that people can have access to them. So you've seen them playing a key role in trying to make sure that people get access to this. But the part of it that's missing from every kind of crisis that we've had around those things has been that there's not been a plan. It's been kind of put together in the middle of the plan. So our the thing that NDOH and the RCCE listening team that is still operating and why it was so good wasn't good to begin with because there wasn't a plan. But you had like some of the best minds in the country going, working, bringing in experts, working out how do we do this, what are the best ways, everyone coming together, finding out and working on something that then they've been able to implement. So, you know, it would have been better if it was there 6 months before, but it wasn't. But for this, we know it's coming. Like, we need to make sure that we've got a plan in place that when the next sort of set of things starts, we've got a way of saying, government will communicate, this is how they're going to communicate, we'll make sure that they are communicating on a regular basis so that you can disseminate and do your jobs, you know. But often you'd have journalists saying, we don't know where to go, we don't know who to speak to, because the police will say, no, we're not allowed to talk about this. We had that, didn't we? You had various ministers saying, I can't comment, or you then had one minister saying X and the other one saying Y. Again, that doesn't, you know, we can understand that now in reflection, but if you're a member of the public, you're going, so this minister has said this is happening and this one has said it isn't happening. What the hell am I meant to believe? You know, which again is why you need the public interests at the fore in that kind of a system, not just leaving it to its own devices.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Bed. In fact, we had we had Mr. Leroux during the week at some point, and we also engaged him on this relationship between kind of inaccurate information from official state people and how that shapes and influences online disinformation. I only have 2 more questions left, and you mentioned the issue of journalists. I think it would be remiss not to think or to rethink what the place of journalists are in an age of information disorder. And this commission had desired to actually call some of the brilliant investigative journalists who had worked on the book 8 Days in July. You remember that that book came before the president's panel. It came before even the convention of these hearings by the commission, and seems to give a timeline, seems to suggest that there were kind of like sources that were able to glean light on what was happening during the July unrest. Could we maybe reflect a little bit on the place of journalists? Because it's interesting in your recommendation that, and when you speak about this RICTT, this Rapid Information Communication Task Team, and the fact that there must be, you must get information fast, there must be constant briefings so that we can understand what the situation is unfolding. But it's interesting that some of the recommendation proposes journalists or the media as a resource somehow for intelligence agencies. They do have sources, they usually have more information than us. We are a human rights commission, so would never compel journalists to reveal their sources in order for us, you know, to reach a destination we want to reach. But what is the place, do we think, of particularly investigative journalists in aiding platforms such as ours to investigate issues that have a direct bearing on democratic and constitutional stability in the country?
So I guess the short answer is you rely on the excellent work that they've produced in order to help inform the Commission and whatever other findings you're going to make. At the time of the crisis, you know, it's what you potentially could do is work with journalists that have been able to, or work with the media. I wouldn't suggest you should be working with the journalists on an individual basis per se, but work with journalists who have been able to get verified information to help alert people to where things are going. You know, and at least to verify that those things are true. It might be that that person is seconded to the task team as an independent journalist for the duration of a crisis, where, for example, say if you set up a proper listening system, you'd have things like Real 411 saying, we're getting these kind of complaints, this is the disinformation that's coming, we need to put out counter messaging, right? On the other side of that, you want to be able to get your proper listening going to say, these are the trends that are coming up. That isn't disinformation, but these and these things we're seeing lots of reports of violence or looting or attacks in these and these areas. You'll then work with your journalist on that team to then say, okay, I'm going to verify this. Yes, this is verified. Okay, we need to actually, then she or he could then feed that to the RICTT. RICTT goes to Nat Joints and they say, listen, we're hearing these and these and these things. You need to go and, send the police, send it, it might be that the Human Rights Commission says, you know what, we're seeing there's a potential for violence, a flare-up of violence here. We're going to send our commissioner there to our people to go and de-escalate, engage with the community, find out what the hell's going on. And we know that that's worked, right? There was a small example of that we did with the Human Rights Commission in 2021. It was the middle of the year. It was just before Youth Day. The first time those Operation Dudula people, and that's an orchestrated plan, right? Clearly, it's not an organic, oh, we hate foreigners, there's a lot of crap there, right? That's a clearly orchestrated plan. We saw there stuff coming in social media, reported to Real 411. We alerted people at the South African Human Rights Commission. Some of their people went to that particular community, and they were able to de-escalate that particular instance. So they didn't need a journalist there, but so I'm just a little bit wary of investigative journalists in the time of crisis. I think that the best way to rely on them is to rely on what they're putting out. The problem with investigative journalism is it takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources, so you're unlikely to get them giving you rapid answers to certain things. I would say that there would be place for media professionals in an RICTT who are able to juggle all the balls, help verify this and this, pick on the trends, and then help feed that to the Human Rights Commission to feed to Nat Joints.
All right, thank you, Sen. You also addressed my last question that I had. So thank you for that. Commissioners, we, from the evidence team, we are happy with the time we've been afforded to ask questions, and we're asking maybe that we take a comfort break. We just have one technical issue to settle in-house, and then also just to allow for a bit of relaxation before we move to your segment.
Yes, we will stand down for 15 minutes until 11:15. Thank you very much. panel will now put questions, and I'm going to give the first opportunity to Commissioner Ntuli, then Commissioner Nissen.
Good morning, Mr. Bird.
Good morning, Commissioner.
I must say, I find it quite symbolically significant that your name is Bird. As you will know, historically, birds were the first source of social media before our more later forms of technology. So it's quite significant, Mr. Bird. I don't know if that's your original name or if you manufactured it.
Social media.
Mr. Bird, on a more serious note, and with reference to your submission, firstly, I must thank you for your submission and your very detailed submission, and congratulate your organization for the very important work that you do. I just have some clarity. I was very confused. I refer you particularly to paragraph 20 and thereafter paragraph 22. Perhaps if we go to paragraph 22, and especially 22.1, you mention a series of tweets that form this content of disinformation or fake news, and then you state in the last sentence, or the last two sentences of that 22.1, that to date, the tweet is still publicly accessible, and the source of the report appears to be the disinformation news site Opera News. And similarly, in 22.2, same, that tweet is still available publicly and continues to be disseminated. Similarly, 22.3, a video that has garnered over 100,000 views. The question would be, why have these not been reported and taken down? Are you able to inform us as to why?
Thanks, Commissioner. Yes, so that was something I referred to earlier. For the platforms, they are reluctant to engage in something, even when, so they know about us and they work with us. Obviously, we've got special flag status with them and whatever else. So in other words, if we submit a complaint to them, it gets seen to on an urgent basis, and we send them regularly takedown requests for certain content, and most of the time they do. We were quite disconcerted that some of the tweets that were reported through the Real 411 system didn't get removed, even though we asked them to. And when I spoke to one of our contacts at Twitter, they explained that it is because of the fact that outside of something big and obvious like an election, or outside of dealing with COVID, where as a big platform they've been able to, determine where their lines lie. Outside of that, they're very reluctant to then actually act on something unless it's a clear breach of their existing policy. And that was why they didn't want to take those things down, because they said, who's to say this isn't a he said, she said scenario? And that's because they're not here. They don't know what's going on in our country, and they don't have a team that's able to say, this is the reality, this is what is happening, this is disinformation, or this isn't disinformation. And that's why, and that's one of the reasons why we need to make sure that if we establish an RICTT, that you are able to bring the platforms on board, so that when something like this happens again, and they get a recommendation from Real 411, it'll come into the RICTT. You'll look at it and everyone will go, okay, do we need to ask the platforms to act on this? They then have the legitimate authority to then say, okay, it's not just this that's asking us, we're getting a properly, and And it's important, this is also why it's so important that it's the South African Human Rights Commission, because of your independent role and powers under the Constitution as a Chapter 9 body, that you can actually ask them to do things and they must comply, or you can subpoena them. And we know that the South African Human Rights Commission, to your immense credit, I must add, under the Matumba case, and I don't know, as I imagine you seized with many, many issues all the time, but one of the big wins about that case that's before the magistrates, before the Equality Court, is that the South African Human Rights Commission was able to get the Twitter to provide a confirmatory affidavit about a particular account. Now, that might not sound like a lot to a lot of people, but understanding that you've got one of the biggest social media companies in the world to do what you ask them to do is an incredibly wonderful achievement. So you have a reason to act on it rather than just us saying this is the case.
Mr. Bird, you'll forgive me for maybe seeming ignorant, but I was of the view that social media platforms such as Twitter, for example, have a function where you can report tweets that are maybe defamatory or otherwise, and they can be taken down. Are you saying that there's no way to do so, and the only way that we could perhaps be able to do so is the institution of this RICTT?
So there are two methods that are broadly available at the moment. You can report within the platform's own reporting tools. And if you look at your, on any of your Twitter posts, if you go to the top near one of the handles, there's a little menu, and if you touch that, various options will arise, and one of them will be disinformation. You can report it if it's self-harm, you can report if it's spam there, and you can report if it's inciting violence effectively. The way to do so is something similar-ish on Facebook, something similar-ish on YouTube, something similar-ish on TikTok. The problem with them all is that they have different standards of what constitutes for them hate speech, and what constitutes for them incitement, and what constitutes for them disinformation. So some of them don't even call it that. Facebook calls it false news. Google's definition is a lot broader. We've written on this actually in some pieces for the media about unpacking these differences. But either way, so that's the one way you do it, is through the platform's own system. The problem with that system is it's not very, and then the way that we envisage it operating would be that when there's a crisis, when Nat Joints is kind of convened for that, SAHRC would be a core component of that as leading the RICTT. You would then hit your little red button that you have in your office, ding, and the RICTT is activated, at which point we all know we get called to a meeting, we go and we sit together, we agree on the parameters of what it's going to be, and we say, right, this is the crisis, let's start rolling out our response to it. And then you would then engage with the Nat Joints. I guess, you know, we're an NGO, we're a little bit scared of giving the power around determining what should stay up and what potentially shouldn't stay up, handing that to police force and to intelligence services and others. There's something uneasy about that, and it just sounds like a bad idea, both politically and I think, you know, the way that it would appear to certain people. Because again, it's got to be independent and it's got to be seen to have credibility, so that the people buy into it. And so that, for that reason, we thought that the South African Human Rights Commission is the body that it should be seized with that task.
So for purposes of clarity, do you see this as incorporating the Human Rights Commission into the Nat Joints, or do you see this RICTT as a subcommittee, a communication subcommittee of Nat Joints?
I mean, we talk about it in paragraph 52. We submit that NAT joints should incorporate the RICTT, that it should be a standing component of NAT joints. Just because in our mind we can't envisage any kind of emerging or crisis that's coming where you aren't going to have a proper, rapid information communication system in place.
Mr. Bird, are you aware that the National Joints is an intelligence structure?
Yes.
Wherein the South African Intelligence Department feeds intelligence into NAT joints as a substructure itself of the security cluster. Are you aware of the structuring of NAT joints in relation to the cluster system of government?
I'd be lying if I said I was intimately familiar with it, no.
I see. What is your vision of the role of the GCIS, the Government Communication Information System, in relation to this proposed RICTT?
I would suspect that they would be a key player or partner of the RICTT. I don't think that they should be leading it for, again, the simple reason that you don't want a government department then being seen to be the ones that are making decisions around what is or what isn't mis and disinformation and structuring that. In the same way as with the National Department of Health that have led the RCCE response to COVID, that they've worked with World Health Organization, UNICEF, various universities, scientists, etc. You need it to be that multi-stakeholder approach. But also because NAT joints is an intelligence structure, it's important, all the more reason why you want to make sure that the public are aware that actually this component of it, there's a bit of an arm's length between us and the intelligence services, because if the moment people see this or perceive this as something that government is using to put out your own kind of counter narrative in a way that it then begins to be something that those putting out this information could use against you. So if you have it as a separate structure that has credibility, that has the platforms on it, etc., I think it gives you that distance. And if it's led by a body that has the credibility and the standing legally and otherwise, then I think it can feed into NAT joints. So we're not asking for you as the Human Rights Commission to then go there, sit on those meetings and come back and feed the intelligence back. I mean, there are reasons that you can't do that, obviously, but it would be beneficial to them for their national response that you can feed back whatever is coming from the listening and the communications that's coming from RICTT.
So you indicate that the Human Rights Commission would lead this committee. Who do you envision or project to be the other organizations that would form part of this RICTT that would be led by the Commission?
So I guess I'm just trying to find where we do specify it in our. I mean, so we talk about it as playing a leading role in that, and that we would then envisage the South African Human Rights Commission saying, okay, we like this idea, and we're going to call together, yeah, there you go, we're going to call together and invite people from DCDT, ICASA, the social media platforms, maybe the mobile operators, the telecoms platforms, some of the civil society. This is detailed in paragraph 54. For your, I'm just summarizing at the moment, but I think that it would be that you would be able to call those bodies together, because some of them, so certainly the media bodies, if you said to the media bodies, right, come and engage with NAT joints directly, they're going to go, not a chance. We can't be compromised in that way. But if it's being part of a task team that feeds into this thing, I think that they would be open to participating in that.
The reason that I asked you if you had an understanding of the structure of nut joints in relation to government's overall structure, especially as an intelligent structure, is how do you reckon that it could be justified that an intelligent structure of government incorporate mainstream media in the form of those you have made an example of in paragraph 54, led by the South African Human Rights Commission?
I mean, to me, I don't see that being a challenge. You know, we're not, the purpose of it, as I said, it's got two particular tasks, is to come up with a risk communication community engagement plan so that we know what to do, what messages, how to target, who can do what, and how to operationalize things. Then proactively identify and address and correct instances of disinformation and harmful speech. So if we accept that that's what we're trying to do, the fact that then that can then feed into nat joints and that nat joint is able to feed back these and these and these things are happening, it can then inform the response of the rapid information task team. Because one of the, I mean, we're working from the simple basis of saying this has to happen. What we're interested in doing is making sure that we've got a good format and formula for it to happen in a way that lends it greater credibility. Because we know that the next crisis, we absolutely have to have a much better, well, we have to have a communication system in place to address the things, to say we know that this unrest is happening in these places, we're aware of it, we're on it. Nat joints can feed into that public statement, they can do all of those things. So I mean, I imagine there will be some tricky bits in ironing out precisely who does what, but if the, on the basis of seeing that nat joints has taken in different role players before, we can't see there being any problem with them taking in the South African Human Rights Commission as a key stakeholder for times of crisis. If they can accept that, and they can accept how that impacts the way that they work, then that's all good.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. That's all from me, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Ntuli. Commissioner Nissen.
Thank you, Chairperson. Some of the questions, I'll just follow up on what Commissioner Ntuli has asked. But Mr. Bird, if your name was going to Commissioner Ntuli, if his name was going to be in Afrikaans, then it would be Willem Fool, which is a bit cruder, so I prefer to William Bird. I've just got three questions for you, sir. The freedom of expression. Now, you know, and my understanding of it is like, for example, if we take the vaccination debate in South Africa today, it's that some people say, I do not want to vaccinate because I have somehow Bill Gates have put a thing into that and now tracking us all over the world. Or somebody says, it's my religion says I cannot be vaccinated. And then we all go and we disagree with each other. And we respect each other's views because that's their way of freedom of expression. But when freedom of expression becomes a tool or a way of, when it's, let me say, if freedom of expression finds itself in a harmful and a destructive manner, and I'll give you two examples, or maybe three. With regard to disinformation and misinformation. I've been in the last few years been very much involved in communities where there's a lot of unrest and protest. In this one community in the Overberg, when the season for the harvest is over, then people coming from the Eastern Cape are just being dropped. And then they've got nowhere to go. And in this particular town, people then, they were chased out of this town and eventually they squat in one area. And then we engaged with the community, with the municipality, and we eventually got a team together with the people and the technical people of the municipality to find and look for area where we can have a temporary residence area for this group of people. And the community was waiting while this discussion is happening. But because it's an affluent area, and one part of that land identified is next to this affluent area, the ward councillor or the councillor then, whilst they agree on this is the area we're going to be, sent a message to the group of people waiting for the outcome to say, these people inside here are playing with you, you better do something. This angered that community, and they went into town and burned down the market, right? So that's the first one. The second one is a ex-parole in the Cape Flats kidnapped a 5-year-old girl, spent a whole week with her, murdered her, raped and murdered her, and the community rallied since the first day around, even including organizations like Missing Pink Ladies and everybody, to look for this person. And at any given time, somebody would post, I saw him here, I saw him there, I saw him there. And then people mobilized and rushed to the area. And then one incident, they then saw, and person saw by his mother's grave that they saw him running into the school and saw him in the school. The whole community descended on that school and almost burned half the school to the ground. The man was, in the meantime, 800 kilometers away, where the police got hold of him in Craddock. So both of these are really where misinformation, disinformation cause terrible injury and loss of life and also destruction. So my battle that I have is that at what point do you draw the line of freedom of expression? Because clearly here information, which is disinformation that was sent, caused so much harm and destruction of property, and also sometimes lead to people losing their lives. So if you could just guide us on that.
I mean, that's exactly why we set up Real 411 to help work through those kinds of questions, and it's why you've got 4 people that review each piece of content. Because you have to assess each on its merits and on what's there. And if we find that it's clearly verifiably false, and if there's a real risk of public harm, and if they look at it and they decide actually this potential harm is imminent, then we can mark it urgent and it can get sent to the platform for takedown as soon as possible. And that means you can get that piece of content taken down in a matter of hours. So that is a form that does impinge on the right to freedom of expression, there's no doubt, right? But it's based on looking at the content at the time and saying, on the evidence and on this and this basis, we think that this actually is likely to cause harm, and you balance that against, well, is there an interest in leaving that? Is there a public interest in leaving that content up? If there's a public interest in leaving that content up, then you're not going to take it down anyway, right? So there is a need in various instances to have a legitimate incursion into freedom of expression. There's no doubt. We've got that all the time. You know, people think, oh, you're creating new things. It's not new. We accept in South Africa that the use of the K word is unacceptable. You don't do it. People that do that, they use that, you report them, they should be taken down instantly. That's an incursion on the right to freedom of expression. No doubt about it. But it's one that, as a society and as a rights-based organization and certainly as a Human Rights Commission, you would say, yes, that constitutes hate speech, it's unacceptable, we're not going to tolerate it. So there are necessarily incursions into freedom of expression, but it's done on the basis of saying, how do we make sure that we can actually build and promote and develop and protect the other rights? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. The only problem is that the recipients of that message are filled with emotion and anger, and once it's out there, they run with it. My second one, also coupled to that, is that also during these unrest and protests, you'll find that there are people that not necessarily are involved in it, or maybe in a different community that wants to mobilize people, but will also send, disinformation around, they're going to come do this, they're going to come do that, close your door, close the street, all of those kind of things. But it's not, it's also what I would understand, and we're trying to understand what happened in July, especially around the tweets. Who are these people? What are they? But I find that in this country, that there are certain people with agendas that are not necessarily those people who are protests or the others, the same, they don't share that agenda. But, and I want to put it this way, is there a third hand that seeks to destabilize by using social network platforms to send out this information?
Okay, so I'll get the first thing is just to respond to a comment you said. Once it's out there, the people are already mad and angry. I mean, that's the point of disinformation, is to further heighten people's anger, frustration, and get them not to think, not to ask questions, get them to go out and beat up a foreigner because they can, right? That's what you want them to do. You want them to be able to do something like that, or be so fearful that they don't leave the house because they're scared that there's a group of people running down the road that's going to kill them in their houses any moment now. So they want to generate that kind of fear and anger. When you look at the reasons of why people manufacture or create mis and disinformation, there are three basic reasons. The one is people do it to get their kicks. Some people like to cause trouble. They like to make people fearful. They like to make people angry. They just want to burn shit down, as one of those expressions from one of those movies goes, right? They just want to do bad things. Your second reason is people do it for money. They're part of a bot farm, or they're part of a farm of users who will happily post whatever message you tell them to post. So they'll just post it, they'll earn money for it. In the case of in the Mr. Matumba case, the person behind the Tracy Ziller account was posting racist and misogynist content, not because they were racist or misogynist or supported that in any way or for political gain, but in order to drive traffic to make money, right? So there are varying ways of making money, but that's why they were pushing that disinformation. And the third one is ideology, and that there's some kind of clear systematic or strategic communication. Now, we know this happens. We saw it with Bell Pottinger in South Africa. We've seen it with various other, strongly driven as a coordinated plan to create havoc and promote some kind of xenophobic agenda. In this case of this violence, it's clear whether there was a coordinated attack by one or small group of people, but it is clear from just the examples that we've put in our submission that wasn't just something that magically happened. You may have got someone who mistakenly said, I've seen that rapist is down there. But you know that there are people that think about these things that go and they do it in order to undermine trust. And you can see that the nature of many of those, of that content, and if you look at the networks and how those things were structured, this wasn't just a haphazard, oh, oopsie, we did this off our own bat. There was definitely a planned, coordinated process to some of that content.
Thank you. Then the last one is on the net joins. My colleague, Commissioner Tuli, my colleague, has already asked you quite a number of issues around that. I've got a few concerns. The South African Human Rights Commission in the province do participate in the various provinces with government departments and those agencies in what we call the Prof Jocks, where they're invited to, or sometimes people the commission in those areas can also go and sit into those meetings and so on. The problem that I have is that journalists need to be acting without fear or favor, and they must be independent. And if there's any information going into like net joins, remember crime intelligence also sitting there. And what if out of those information, that information, there is maybe a criminal investigation and a trial, And what will then the role of the South African Human Rights Commission be? Will we be called, or the journalists called, to come and testify or not testify in the event? I know it's a worst case scenario that I'm sketching to you. But then the second thing is that, whilst we're working very well with journalists, in fact, they sometimes give us to say, do you know this has happened on this farm? Do you know that's there? Are you going to do something about it? Or can you go there? That's a very healthy relationship that we have. But we do not want a situation where journalists become too cozy with government or with arms of government. And I will take you back to what happened, for example, in the Western Cape, the brown envelopes. And one wants to also not want to see the journalist later on as a spy for you, but to have a healthy relationship and not to be too cozy, not to be seen as a spy, but as to be seen as a resource to be used in the furtherance of stability and democracy in this country. Your comments, sir?
I mean, your comment about them participating in ProvJocs already then suggests that there's almost semi-precedent for the role that the Human Rights Commission can play if there's an RICTT. So that, I think, is really good. So look, when we talk about this, we certainly are not suggesting that the media are cozying up to government and that they're sitting in on the NAT joint meetings. They're not. SAHRC would be there to participate in those. The role of the RICTT is to set up risk communication, community engagement task team, and to address mis and disinformation and harmful content. That's it. So in that process, it means you need the media to be part of that. They're not there because they're your buddies, and it's not like you're having journalists there left, right, and center. You would probably have media representative bodies like a SANEF or the Press Council or the Broadcast Complaints Commission, bodies that are familiar and understand the media and that work with the media, but not, we're not suggesting for a single second that you're having the editors all there, participating in this thing. Not at all. What you do want them to be, though, is to be informed and to know and know what the hell is going on. It's in everyone's interest that they know, okay, Nat Joint is meeting this morning. The meeting's ending at 11. At 11, we're going to get information from SAHRC that's going to say these and these and these are the things that are there. They don't have to report that. No one's telling them that they have to do it, but they can say these and these are the key messages. We're going to put this out on social media. We're going to put this out there. Media, you know about it. Do what you want with it. So, SABC, can we do some public service announcements about this community is in desperate need of food because of this particular crisis? Help it. Maybe media, you can speak to your friends at, or we can help us reach out to Gift of the Givers or other types, so that you get people involved. So they're not there to cozy up and do that. They are there, as you say, as a resource, but critically so that they can get access to up-to-date information. Because at the moment, those systems just aren't there, and they are flailing around just like the public, and that shouldn't be the case. They should be going, we know what's going on, we have access to these things. They say, so if they come back and it says, the Minister of Intelligence says this and this is going on, we can say, as the media house, they can say, the Minister said this, but actually our sources are saying something very different. No one's saying they can't do that. They must do that if they have a reason to doubt it. But in terms of being able to be there with the platforms, you want the platforms there because you want to be able to say, look, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. You need to know this so that your systems can be ready for whatever things are coming down the line. It's more about giving them the information so that they can act. It's not about telling them what to do or expecting them to toe a particular line, not at all.
Thank you, Mr. Bird, and thank you for MMA and the sterling work that you've been doing, and thank you for your presentation this morning, and really our understanding about the media, and we really appreciate the role that they're playing, and particularly in the life of the South African Human Rights Commission, and certainly we'll take that up. Your recommendations will be discussed within the Commission. Chairperson, that's all from me.
Thank you very much, and I have nothing more to add at this point in time. We'd like to thank you very much for your insightful evidence and also your specific proposals that we will most definitely consider. Thank you again, and you are excused, or you can also stay if you want, because we just need to make a final announcement before we adjourn.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for all the questions. Good luck with your discussions.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the testimony for the day. Today, Friday, the 4th of March, 2022, marks the final day of the second leg of the National Investigative hearing into the July 2021 unrest, affecting in particular KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. This does not preclude further evidence from being heard by the hearing panel, and to the extent necessary, further evidence will indeed be heard or being dealt with in terms of written submissions being considered. The process of the first and second legs entailed 5 weeks of hearing oral evidence from members of the affected communities, political leaders and state officials, ministers as well at local, provincial and national level, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, private enterprises and all affected stakeholders. The South African Human Rights Commission also received large volumes of written submissions in regard to the July 2021 unrest. The first leg of the hearing commenced in KwaZulu-Natal on the 15th of November 2021, and it was heard over a 3-week period and lasted until the 3rd of December 2021. The second leg of the hearing lasted a further 2 weeks, was held here in Gauteng, and commenced on the 21st February 2022 until today, the 4th of March 2022. The hearing panel will reconvene on Friday, the 1st of April 2022, when the President of the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, will appear and give evidence in regard to the July 2021 unrest. The Commission, the South African Human Rights Commission, will keep members of the media informed of all developments so that you can also inform the public in that regard. So on the 1st of April 2022, the President will appear before the hearing panel of the South African Human Rights Commission. We need to reiterate that the National Investigative hearing into the July 2021 unrest emanates from the Commission's mandate under Section 184(2), which empowers it to investigate and report on the observance of human rights and to take steps to secure appropriate redress where human rights have been violated. That is now Section 184(2) of the Constitution. Considering the extent to which human rights were impacted during the events that occurred between the 8th and the 19th of July 2021 in the provinces of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, the Commission exercised its constitutional and statutory mandate to investigate the causes of the unrest as well as the impact of the unrest on human rights. The South African Human Rights Commission will now collate all the oral evidence heard and all the written submissions received in drafting its report containing our findings, recommendations and directives. As outlined, the Commission has a large volume of evidence to work through and will not be able at this stage to state when its provisional report will be available and then also its final report thereafter, but we can commit to making every resource available to finalize and release our report as soon as possible, with the caveat, obviously, that further evidence might be heard where necessary. I would like to thank my fellow hearing panelists, being Commissioners Ntuli on my left and Commissioner Nissen on my right, for the sterling work they have also done in making sure that the process is a seamless process and that all the evidence could be heard. I'd also like to, we as a panel would also like to thank the evidence team for their great work, and all the other staff members in the South African Human Rights Commission who made these hearings possible. In turn, we would also like to thank the media for covering this important hearing in ensuring that the testimonies heard and evidence given was brought to the general public. Thank you very much. On that note, unless there's anything further from the evidence team, we can adjourn. Anything else? Thank you so much again. We are adjourned.